Lord, you are so gracious and loving. We thank you for the opportunity to read your word freely. We thank you for the opportunity to hear teaching from your word freely. And now, Lord, as we look at this passage, we ask that you would unpack it for us. As we prayed before, Lord, still our hearts, still our minds, allow us to hear from you. Challenge us with what we need to be challenged with. Spirit, do your work in and amongst us, we pray. And Lord, use my words for your glory. In your name, amen. Hey, I have a problem with Mark. I have a really big issue with Mark. So can you talk to him about it? And can you deal with it? Because I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to talk to him. So if you could do that, that'd be great. Good. Yep, fantastic. Good, thanks. So I'm having this issue with Coralie. I'm not actually going to talk to her about it. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to get angrier and angrier at her when she does it, not mention a word, and then at one point I'm going to explode irrationally and she'll have no idea where that has come from. Is that a good? Yep, good. Excellent. Thank you. Good. So I've called this meeting today to deal with an issue that only one of us has a problem with. Enid has been doing this issue, and I'm not actually going to talk to Enid. I'm going to instead talk to everybody about this issue, but everybody sitting there knows that they don't have the issue, that only Enid has the issue, but I don't want to talk to her about it, so let's all spend an hour talking about an issue that only one of us has. Good, excellent, fantastic, thanks. Dealing with conflict is hard, right? And we've seen it being dealt with so many ways in our own lives that are not helpful, that it's not affirming, that it's not productive, that it's not effective. But in this chapter, we have a biblical example of dealing with an issue, a biblical example of conflict resolution, of confrontation with another believer, with someone that you have a problem with. I think sometimes we really struggle to know what to do when we have issues with people, and often we don't deal with it in the most helpful way. In this chapter, through Nehemiah, we get a biblical model of what to do, a biblical model of how to talk to them about it and how to deal with it. And so that's kind of what we're looking at today in Nehemiah chapter 5, conflict resolution and finding a biblical way of doing it. See, the issue that comes up for Nehemiah is that the nobles and the rulers were using a heavy hand amongst the Jews in a really difficult situation at a difficult time. Nehemiah, through dealing with this issue, therefore uses a helping hand, not a heavy one. So let's get into the passage. Verse 1. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. And the implication here is that there is a famine in the land. As a result, food was scarce and it was expensive. But beyond that, the idea is that the Jews who did have fields weren't able to tend them because they were doing the building project. And so taking away from the idea of raising money and making food for themselves while they did the building of the walls. What's more is, as we saw in chapter 4, the surrounding nations weren't happy with what the Jews were doing. And so as a result, this would have meant that trading between the Jews and the other nations would have at best radically reduced, at worst would have stopped completely. Again, making food a lot more expensive and hard to come by. As a result, a lot of the Jews in the area were struggling. These fall into three main categories, and we see this in verses 2 to 4. The first category is this, verse 2. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." And this group were like, we've got big families, we need food in order to stay alive, we don't have food. This category is most likely the landless. Those who worked as hired labourers and tenant farmers. They were the guys who would come in and look after other people's property. But because there wasn't much food around, the food was extremely expensive, like chili mud crab expensive. And so they didn't have the money to buy the food that they needed in order to keep themselves and their family members alive. The second category is seen in verse 3. Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine." The second group was like, we need to mortgage our fields and vineyards and our homes in order to get the money that we need in order to survive. These are most likely small landowners who were being forced to mortgage their fields for food. And the only way they could afford to eat, therefore, is for them to go into debt. And then the last category, verse 4, still others. We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our field and vineyards. This group had to go into debt in order to pay the tax. So for the food, they were okay, but the tax was just far, far too much for them. And so when they were borrowing money, the implication here is that they were borrowing it at a crazy interest rate that they weren't able to afford. The key issue here is that because of the famine, and because of the building project, the Jews were struggling. They were poor, they were in poverty, they had no food. But the rich rulers, the rich nobles, were using this situation for them to benefit financially. They were using this situation for greed, to get more money out of those who were extremely suffering, and putting the hard force on people who could not bear it. So let's look a little bit more at what they were doing. First thing, they were charging interest. Now, it was okay for a Jew to lend money to another Jew. That was all right. But what it wasn't okay is for that Jew to charge interest on the money that they borrowed. And that is what Nehemiah claims they were doing in verse 7. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, you are charging your own people interest. Now, it was okay for a Jew to charge interest on a commercial loan, but it wasn't okay to charge interest on a personal loan, and that is what was happening. These people were going into debt in order to buy food. As a result, they shouldn't have been charged interest according to Jewish law, but they were. So, let's put it this. Steve, do you have some money? I want to borrow $100 from you. Okay, cool. So then he gives me $100. Okay, 250s. And then what I do is then I have to pay him interest on this money. Okay, so that's the idea here. All right. So then I pay him interest on the money. And so then when I do pay him back the $100, I can pay that back. But then I have to add another 10, another 20, another however much more on top of that to give me the ability to borrow. And that's what was happening in this situation. They were illegally charging interest when they should not have done so. Okay, but, and keep the money handy, I'm going to need it some more. Now, the other thing is, it's not just that they were borrowing money, but what would happen is the Jews would take possession or something collateral like a pawnbroker. Okay, so in this situation, let's say this is a very expensive basketball card. Okay, it's not really, but let's just say it is. Okay, and let's say this has really meaning to me, like it's $1,000 basketball card. Okay, and so what will happen is I will borrow the money off Steve again, but I have to give him something collateral in order to buy the money. So the idea is he holds on to that until I'm able to afford to give him the money back, and then I get the property back. But here we're not talking about basketball cards. Here we are talking more along the lines of property or valuables or things that were really hard for them to let go of and would possibly have put them even worse into a worse position than they already were. Okay, so then I get the money back and I get my property back. Shaquille O'Neal, just in case anyone was looking at it. Okay, so that's another idea. Now, the final idea, okay, we find in verse 5. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others, because they had to mortgage them or use them as in a pawnbroker way. This term for daughters have already been enslaved. One translation has it as our daughters have been ravished. This could mean that they were forced into marriage or possibly worse. Okay, so according to Jewish law, if someone couldn't afford to pay back a debt, then they couldn't become a slave. But what would happen is that person would then become a hired labourer or servant for the man that they owed the money back in order to pay off that debt, pay off that loan. But you couldn't force someone into slavery to pay off a debt. And yet, that is what was happening here. Okay, so then let's look at what that's like. This is my son. This is a picture of me and my son Joshua. I'm using Joshua for this example because I haven't used him much, but I could be using Sam or Grace. I'm not just wanting to make Josh a slave. I treat and love you all equally. However, having said that, it was unlikely going to be Sam because Sam was the firstborn, and firstborns are really important in this culture. So let's say I want to borrow $100, and so I borrow my $100. So he put it away. He thought it was over. Okay, so I borrowed the $100, but in order to do that, I have to make Josh a slave. And so now Josh becomes, he's really upset about that. Now, as Josh is now Steve's slave, until I can raise the money and pay him off and redeem Josh as slave, and so Josh then comes back to me and I pay back the money. Okay, so that is what was happening to the Jews. They were being forced to sell their children into slavery in order for them to get the money, to get the food that they needed in order to survive. Verse 8 puts it like this: as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. Now, the idea here is that the Jews had worked hard at bringing back Jews who were slaves in foreign countries, and they worked hard at trying to redeem them and bring them back into Jerusalem and back into the Jewish nation and being free men again. But by the rulers and the nobles doing that, they're kind of taking them and using them as their own slaves. It's like the Jewish rulers are saying, well, it's not okay for you to do that, but it is okay for me to do that. There is this game in kids ministry. We use it in youth group too, but not as much. It's called Empty the Nest, okay? So you have like a hula hoop, and that is your nest, okay? And then you have balls. And the idea is that you will go and run to someone else's nest, you will take the ball that is theirs, and then you will come and put it in your own nest. You can only take one ball at a time, and so it basically means kids run like lunatics around the hall and get very, very tired. Leaders love this game. So they're running around with the ball, and the idea is that when the leaders think that they have finally had enough, they will call out time, and the team with the most balls in their nest, or eggs, if you'd like to keep the analogy, that team wins. Okay? Now, with what was happening, let's say that this is a Jewish slave. The Jews, this team, was going, okay, we want to bring all the slaves back into Jerusalem so that they can be free men, right? But the problem was, then they were taking the free men and making them slaves again in their own nest. This was hypocritical. This was unloving. This was against the law, and they didn't care because they were financially benefiting from it, using a heavy hand for their own desires, for their own financial success, while not caring about the people that they hurt along the way. So this is the situation. This is what was happening to the Jews. This is what gets Nehemiah angry. And I want to just pause briefly there because there's an application point in here for us. Throughout the Bible, those who exploit the poor are repeatedly denounced. God is grieved when rich people take advantage of the poor, especially poor believers. For the poor believers are watched over by our Heavenly Father, and to mistreat them is to insult God. And Christians then, we have to continue to stand against all injustice and all forms of exploitation in any way that we find them occurring. Social justice then is not a radical ideology. Social justice is a core movement of the heart of God. Social justice is what God cares about because he doesn't want his people to be mistreated or to be used or taken advantage of. In the same way, then social justice must be reflected in our lives, that we would seek the benefit of those who are in poor, those who are struggling, those who do not have much. And we must make sure that we are never intentionally or unintentionally benefiting of the exploitation of this group of people. However, sometimes I think we do. And I don't think we're always aware of it. Now, there are many ways I could talk about this, but I want to talk about one briefly, and that is that we would be ethical consumers. There are companies that we buy products from that treat horribly their workers in different countries. Sweatshops, underage workers, not paying them a living standard of wage. All of this happens and enables us to get our product at a cheaper price. Where possible then, we must not add to that system, not add to that exploitation. Now, there are a number of ways that we can do this, but just simple ones. When we are buying clothes or coffee or chocolate, making sure that they are sourced sustainably, but they are sourced fairly in relation to the workers. So looking for chocolate or coffee that has the fair trade symbol on it, even when it means we have to pay an extra couple of bucks more. And when I mean the fair trade symbol, I don't mean the frog. That's a different thing, and that can be slightly misleading. Another thing here that is helpful is Baptist World Aid have this amazing resource called the Ethical Fashion Guide. Okay, so you can download it for free. I did this week, and it's really well known in the secular world as well. What they do is they look at all the clothing companies and look at how they produce their clothing items, how they source the primary material, how they put it together, and the whole process along the line. They then give that company a ranking, basically A+ to an F. This then helps us to be informed about where our money is going to. What shops are using ethical ways of making their products and what shops are not. And then changing our purchase behavior as a result. So I did this. I looked up the clothing shops that I like or that I go to. Cotton On and Politics get a very decent A-, so I was really happy with that. Unfortunately, Connor and Tarot Cash, not as good with a C+. But hey, Witchery is A-, so all things are safe. Knowing this information, and yes, obviously I don't shop at Witchery, that is a female shopping, that was the joke. Thank you for laughing, Ari. So the idea there though is if we are aware of these companies, then we can spend our money appropriately and support those that do ethical things and ethical sourcing of their materials. Cool? Okay, and that's just one, and there's a whole heap more on there, but I'll just stop it there. Okay, that's the first thing I wanted to draw on today. But the second thing, and the thing that we'll spend a little bit more time on, is that of how Nehemiah deals with conflict. Because here, he has, raised by the people, an internal issue. The people have raised a major problem with him. And I think we can learn a lot about dealing with conflict in our own lives by looking at how Nehemiah dealt with it in this situation. There are 4 points then that I want to make here. The first is listen, think about it, confront, and then sacrificial leadership, because that's what I see coming out of this chapter. Okay, the first is listen. Verse 6, and I became very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. Nehemiah is very empathetic. He truly listens to what the people are saying, and they're saying that they're financially devastated. Nehemiah listens and takes it seriously. Listening, then, is one of the most frequently ignored skills of leadership and communication. Because to actually listen, to quell the thoughts in your mind and to just intake what the other person is saying to you, and doing so with your whole being, that takes time and that takes effort. And it can be uncomfortable. And what they're saying might be uncomfortable. It means we need to stop talking. It means we need to stop devising a comeback, a response, and take in what is being spoken. Understand it and intake it. And it's especially important for those of us in leadership to be good listeners. I know I've talked about soccer a lot. It's the beginning of the season and it's really in my head, right? So I'm the coach of my son Joshua's soccer team. I've been coach of that team for 3 years, but we had a couple of extra new kids come in to the team this year. And the parents don't know me at all, and they're like, who is this guy with the really weird beard? And so in the first training, I finished it a little bit early and I just talked to the parents. I sent the kids off with a soccer ball and prayed that they wouldn't kill each other. And then I talked to the parents. And I talked about my soccer coaching methodology, which is I don't care if we win or not. I just want the kids to have a good time and equal time on the field. And I'm just worried about the best interests and good sportsmanship and all this stuff. But then I said, hey, I really want you, when you have a problem, to come and talk to me about it. I am not a perfect coach. I get things wrong. If I'm not putting your kid in the position that you want him to be in, or you think he's on the bench for too long, please come and talk to me. My door is already open, always open. I want to hear from you. Because being a father of a son who plays soccer, I know what can happen. You're sitting on the sideline and the coach is making all this, oh, no, he didn't, don't like that. The coach, he benched him again. Oh, no, coach, put him in that position. Oh, coach, come on, coach. And all the parents are on the sideline and they're talking about the coach, but no one actually tells the coach about it. Someone needs to tell the coach about it. And it's the same thing in this situation when we're dealing with conflict. The first thing is that someone needs to raise the issue. And when the issue is raised, there needs to be listening about it. As a church leadership, we want to hear from you. As a church leadership, we are not perfect. I am not the perfect pastor. I am not the perfect person. I'm not the perfect leader. I will make mistakes. I will do and say things that you are annoyed about and that you are frustrated about and you don't like me doing. Yes? I want you to talk to me about it. The goal is that I would listen like Nehemiah, that I would sit and take you seriously. And if you've told me before and I haven't done anything about it, I apologize. I struggle in that area, but please talk to me about it again, or go and talk to Steve or Neil and let's fix it up. What we can't have as a church is people in the background going, oh, I don't like how he did that. Oh, I don't like how he did that. No, talk to us about it. And then as leadership, when we are spoken to, we must listen and take it seriously and do something with it. Okay. That's the first thing for us to listen. But then the second thing is that we must think through our response. Verse 6. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and accused the nobles and officials. In verse 6, Nehemiah, having had listened, he gets angry. This is the same passion that we see in chapter 1. When he heard about the situation in Jerusalem. This is the same passion he shows here when he hears that the Israelites are being taken advantage of by their own, and breaking the Jewish law in doing so. Nehemiah is rightly angry, but he doesn't just jump into action. He takes a beat. He takes a step. He slows it down, and he thinks about his response. He thinks about his next step. He thinks about how he's going to deal and confront this issue. Anger can be a helpful, motivating force leading to affirmative action. But anger can also be like that backyard hose that is like full-on ball and just flying around the backyard. And it is like doing damage, and it's breaking that flower, and it's breaking those pots, and it's damaging the fence, and it's hurting Grace because it's scored her in the leg, and the hose full-on ball is not helpful. What we need to do is grab the hose and put the water where it needs to be. What that looks like for us is we take a beat, we slow it down, we think it through before we say something out of a knee-jerk reaction, before we say something out of pure anger. We think through how we're going to deal with this issue. Okay, so to give an example, Steve says something angry to me. It's not even angry. He says something that I don't like, and that made me angry. And so I got angry at Steve, and then Steve gets angry at me, and then I get angry at him, and then he gets angry at me, and then one of us says something really, really hurtful that we wish we had never said. Well, no. Steve says something to me that I don't like. I take a pause. I step back. Now, I'm using Steve as an example here because I literally have never seen him angry. But he says something, I take a pause. I take a pause. I try and understand what his perspective is, why he's saying that. Maybe he's right. Maybe I am doing something wrong that I need to address. I figure out how I'm going, pray about it. I take it to God. God, show me what to do in this situation. And then I don't send him an email. I don't send him a text. We meet, we sit down, we have a real conversation about it, and we deal it out. Yes, in love, in mutual respect, in humility, the lack of pride, in patience and kindness. That is a much better way of dealing through it. But the first thing is to take a step back. There's been many times in my pastoral ministry, not so much here, thankfully, but definitely previously, where I've received an email that has gotten me angry. Yeah, this guy, then I'll reply, oh, I can't believe you said that, that's ridiculous, what do you think you're doing? Oh my goodness, you have no idea what I go through. And then I take a step back, and then I calm down, and then I pray about it. And then I come back to my computer and go, I'm really glad I did not send that email. Delete, 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 rewrite. Often when we have an issue, a knee-jerk reaction, we need to step that back, think it through, pray about it, and then come to the situation in a better way. Ideally in person, please, emails and texts are not the best way of dealing with issues. Okay, so then we have listening, we have thinking it through. The next thing that we have is that Nehemiah actually confronts the issue with the people. And the way that he does this is really interesting. It almost, like, there's real echoes of it following the Matthew 18 confrontational model. Okay, so please look at that at a different time. I'm not touching it here, but it's very similar. There's very similar notes in these two ways of dealing with it. So Nehemiah deals with it head on. He calls it as it is. Verse 7, you are charging your own people interest. He didn't deal with it by first calling a great assembly and saying, we all have a major issue here. He dealt with it mano a mano. When there is an issue, first thing we want to do is take it to the person one-on-one. Not taking it, we don't take it first to the ministry leaders. We don't take it first to their parents. We don't talk about it with our friends. The most biblical way of dealing with conflict is in person with the person we have the issue with. I kind of talked about this in my intro, but we have all been in those meetings in the workplace, right? Where we have a slightly passive-aggressive manager who does not like dealing with conflict. And there's this one person who's doing the wrong thing. But rather than the manager talking to Ethel about doing the wrong thing, the manager calls this massive meeting where you go through step by step this policy area and everyone sitting down knows exactly what the manager is doing. It's not me. I don't have the issue. Ethel has the issue. But you're wasting all of our time because you're not dealing with it one-on-one. We've all been in that situation. Well, at least I have, for sure. And that is not a helpful way of dealing with conflict. It must be done person to person first. Lloyd Ogilvie used to say to his pastoral staff, never say about someone something you are unwilling to say to that person within 24 hours. Dealing with it with them personally. And I think that's a good concept to remember. Then Nehemiah, after dealing with it man on man, he then gets in the big group and he does this for transparency and to show everybody what is going to be done about this issue that was affecting the community as a whole. And then what he does is he brings in the priests and the church leadership into this. This happens in verse 12. We will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, in this way, may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. And Nehemiah is going, okay, you're saying that you're going to do the right thing. Fantastic. But I want to add another layer of accountability here. I want you to swear on it on a Bible. In a sense. Make an oath about it. With the concept being, if that oath is breaking, there will be consequences. And the consequences that Nehemiah talks about here, he does by symbolically shaking out his robes, right? And from our perspective, what? he's just doing these ones. And all the Jews around go, yeah, that makes sense. And we're going, why is he doing these ones? Okay, so in that time, the robe was like it was like pockets, okay? And so what Nehemiah is doing is he's emptying out their pockets of all their material possessions. And so let's give an example of what that might look like. All right, well, the first is my wallet. So that refers to all the money that I have, including in all of the bank accounts, and that is all now gone because that is emptied. The next thing that I have is my phone, bye-bye to my phone, that goes, and that also represents technology. So not only does my phone go, but also my laptop, my Switch, my Xbox 360, my PS4, my Wii, and my iPad, my Kindle. They're all gone, okay? So now I've lost that as well. But what else have I lost? I've lost my car. My car goes, if I empty out my pockets, there goes my really nice Kia Carnival. Food, all my food goes, represented by the little Vegemite tin. So all the food in my pantry, that is now lost to me as well. I have a Lego brick, and that refers to all the toys that I have. So all my puzzles, all my games. If you've been to my house and seen my games cupboard, it is a hefty loss for me. So my games are gone. And then my basketball collection, my basketball card collection is gone. My book collection, that's gone too. All the books are gone. My clothing. This is Grace's Barbie dress. My clothing is gone because that was also in my pocket, and that empties me out. See, the idea here then is that I have empty pockets, that I have nothing left because God has emptied me out of all my belongings if I break the oath. So when he's shaking out his robe, that's kind of what he's referring to. That if these rulers and nobles don't do what they say, God will empty them out of all that they have. And then verse 13, at this, the whole assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. The whole assembly was in agreement. They had unanimous consent. Now, that's basically the confrontation. He actually does something with it. But I know I'm running a little bit over. I want to touch on one point here. The response of the nobles when they are confronted with what they have done. Verse 8b, they kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. When confronted with the issue, the nobles didn't make excuses. They didn't attempt to lay blame. They didn't get overtly defensive. They didn't attempt to rationalize their behavior. They didn't say, well, this is only happening because of the Persian occupation. Well, hey, Nehemiah, we're in the middle of a famine too. This is affecting me financially as well. Well, hey, Nehemiah, you don't understand my plight. You don't understand what I'm going through as a rich person. You don't understand, Nehemiah, so you can't tell me this. No. The nobles are silent. They take it. When someone tells them what they are doing is wrong, they don't deflect, they don't get angry, they don't get defensive, they don't throw excuses, they take it. When we have a situation where someone is confronting us with an issue, our first response is too often, excuses, rationalizations, you don't understand, defensive reactions. What we need to be doing is humbling ourselves, being willing to take advice and rebuke from others who love us and want what is best for us. And go, yeah, you might have a point. Yeah, I did do that wrong. I'm sorry. Yeah, I've been struggling in this area, but you're right. I will try and get better at it. I'm sorry for the way that has affected you. That's a much better way of responding to conflict than defense or anger or rationalization or blame throwing. Then the last point here is Nehemiah's sacrificial modelling. See, you've got this whole passage, right, where Nehemiah is pulling up the nobles and saying you're doing the wrong thing because you're trying to exploit poor people. And then in verse 14 to 19, it's kind of like this breakout of the storytelling, right? It steps away from the chronology of the piece, and it talks about the 12 years that Nehemiah was the governor of the people. And it does so with an emphasis showing that Nehemiah is sacrificially leading them. See, governors were allowed to take a tax from the people. Governors were allowed to take food from the people. Governors were allowed to take a property from the people, but Nehemiah does none of that. Instead, Nehemiah pays for hospitality out of his own bank account, out of his own money. And it was a big bill. Verse 18, each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, some poultry were prepared for me. And every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor because the demands were heavy on these people. Nehemiah did not benefit financially from his office, nor by any land. He did not collect the governor's provision from the people, as was his right to do so. And even when he had to feed local officials as well as dignitaries, he did so out of his own pocket, and it would have been hefty. Like an ox, 6 choice sheep, and chicken and fowl, like a day, that's huge. But then an abundant supply of wine. And I like that, of all kinds. He's got like Sauvignon Blanc, his Pinot Noir, his Rose, his Shiraz, his Merlot Cab Sav, and probably even a Pinot Gris if he's feeling a little bit fruity. The idea is that there was a lot of stuff here, and he sacrifices that. because he just pulled up someone else for doing the same thing, and he didn't want to be in those footsteps. He wasn't going to be hypocritical. He then, after pulling up someone for doing the wrong thing, he modelled the right thing in terms of his leadership. We often have to deal with issues. We are sinful people. And we splash that sin on others, and it's going to raise issues. And it does so in the church. And when it does, there is a helpful way of dealing with it and an unhelpful way of dealing with it. We need to take a leaf here out of Nehemiah's book. We need to listen. We need to think through our response. We need to actually confront it and not pretend that it's going away. And then we need to model the behaviour that we want to see in others. This is a challenge to me just as much as it's a challenge to anyone else. And there's areas in this that we all need to work on and get better at. Please, will you pray with me? Dear Lord, it's difficult to have these conversations. It's difficult to actually deal with the hurt and the pain that we may be feeling. It's difficult to actually have these raw communications of being honest and open about what's going on. Help us to do so, Lord. Help us to confront issues that we have with other believers and do so in a loving and godly way. Help us to avoid the pitfalls of bad conflict resolution. Help us to think it through. Help us to listen. Help us to confront. Help us to model good behaviour. And I also pray, Lord, that you will help us to care about the exploitation of the poor. That you would help us to care about social justice. That you help us to be concerned about the plight of those who are being dealt a heavy hand. Show us, Lord, what specifically we need to do differently with these things in our lives. In your name, amen.